Before I start, I'd like to take a few moments to pay homage to our ancestors, because it's on their shoulders that we stand. It's believed that they've gone to a higher place, and if we ask them, they'll come be with us in spirit and help this event be a success. I would like to call on some of my ancestors just by calling out their name. You who are watching, if you'd like to have some of your ancestors join us, call out their name. Elroy, come be with us. Laura, come share this event with us. Pookie, come on, be with us. Uncle Allen, help me tonight. And to all the others, come, 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 come. I've had some experiences that I cannot remember. Now, the only way I know they happened are through photos, like this one. That's me when I was 4, 5 years old. That's my younger sister, Rosemary. I assume that our parents decided to bring a little Christmas cheer into our lives. Does it look like we're having a good time? Does it look like we're being very cheerful? I do not think so. Look at my sister reaching out to me for some support or comfort. I'm not sure I was able to give it to her. I believe this was probably the first time I was ever that close to a white man. Now, of course, there are some experiences that I truly remember. Like the time my father was going to give me and my younger brother some money to go buy ourselves a treat at Miss Carey's grocery store that was across the alley from our house. He was going to give one of us a nickel and one of us a dime. And since I was the oldest, he said I could make the choice. Now, my older brother Ernest, he told me to take the dime. But when I looked at it, the nickel was so much bigger. The bigger the money, the more you can buy, right? So I took the nickel. When me and my brother got to Miss Carey's store and stacked up the cookies that we could buy, my brother was able to buy twice as many cookies as I was. The next time my father gave me that choice, guess which one I took? I took the dime. Another experience that I have, it's of George, our paper boy. Well, he wasn't really a boy, he was a man, George. We called him paper boys at that time. I guess today they would be called paper carrier. George had been a paper carrier for a long time. He was about ready to retire. And it looked like it would be so much fun walking up and down the street, slinging papers into people's yards and onto their porch. I went and asked my daddy, "Daddy, can I take George's place?" He said, "We have to talk to George." I went and talked to George. He said yes, and that he would train me. My daddy, he bought me this bright red wagon, and it had extensions on it so we could stack the papers up. The first day I was supposed to deliver papers, my daddy came into my room at 5 o'clock in the morning. I didn't deliver any papers. But I had a great time with that little red wagon. I would ride it up and down the street. I'd put my friends in it. I would pull them. Sometimes they would pull me. We had a great time. If I had to go to a bigger grocery store, I would take it and bring the groceries in the wagon. Ooh, I loved that little red wagon. Sometimes I wonder what happened to it. There's another experience that I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I'm in my right mind. I moved from Nashville to San Francisco in 1984. It was in 1989. I was living in a studio apartment in the Western Addition. It was March 21st at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I got a call. It was from my brother, my oldest brother, Erwin. Tommy, we lost Daddy today. Well, go find him. He can't be that far from the house. You see, I hadn't been home in a long time, and I thought he was playing a joke on me to get me to come home. Tommy, we lost Daddy today. Well, call the police. They'll help you find him. Plus, everybody in the neighborhood practically know him. He can't be that far. Lost Daddy? I heard him, but I didn't hear him. How could we lose Daddy? The man who taught me about money. The man who bought me that red wagon. The man who taught me how to drive. And I learned on a stick shift. Most of the gears now are on the floor. When I learned, the gears were on the column. And with the stick, as some of you may know, you have to adjust the clutch and the gas to move forward. And until you learn how to do it, sometimes you get too much gas, too much clutch, and it's like clanky, 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 cranking back and forth. And if you don't watch out, the motor would down you. And that happened to me. But the worst part is when you got stuck on a hill. Ooh, I took my foot off the brake and it would start rolling backwards. So I had to quickly get the gas and the clutch together so I wouldn't back into somebody. Yep, it did almost happen. Yep, it did almost happen a couple of times. Finally, after about 3 or 4 weeks, I got it. And I was able to drive real smoothly. And I felt so proud of myself. My dad had taught a number of people to drive. But he told anybody that asked, that Tommy, he's the hardest one I ever learned how to drive. How could he be lost? I remember watching TV when we were younger, seeing shows like Leave It to Beaver, My Three Sons. These were white shows. The father would get up in the morning, have breakfast with the family, get his attaché case and go off to work, come back at 5 o'clock, dinner's ready, have dinner, talk to the kids, tell them how much they love them. I never heard my father say that he loved me. So after watching one of those shows, I went up to him and I asked, Daddy, do you love me? He looked at me and said, boy, what kind of fool question is that? I feed you, don't I? You's got a place to stay, ain't you? I sends you to school, don't I? Boy, don't you ever ask me no fool question like that again. And I never did. Tommy, We lost Daddy today. It was beginning to sink in, but I still didn't believe it. I remember going on a road trip with my father from Nashville to Houston to see one of my brothers who had moved there for a job. We had a great time. On the way back, we were driving. It was getting to be about 11:30. I was getting to be a little bit hungry. I asked Daddy, "You want to stop and get something to eat?" He said yes. That kind of surprised me because when we were younger and the fast food restaurants opened up like Burger King, the Whopper, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, we would want to go to the fast food restaurants, but he never wanted to go. One day, I asked him, "Daddy, why don't you want to go to the restaurant with us?" He said, "Boy, why does I want to go to a restaurant when I got plenty of good food back there in my refrigerator?" He said yes to stopping. We stopped. It was a Denny's or a Shoney's or something like that. We went in. We were seated. The waitress brought us the menu. I was looking at mine when I felt some tension coming from the other side of the table. Remember, my father was born in 1910. He went to school for the first, second, and third grade. At that time, he had to go to work in the fields, in particular, tobacco. So he didn't get very much formal education. Feeling this tension, I looked over and I saw that he looked very puzzled. He was looking at his menu, but he had it upside down. I reached over gently, took the menu, and said, "Daddy, would you like to have some coffee?" "Yes," he said. "How about some eggs?" "Yes, that would be nice. You want some bacon?" He said yes to that. We had a great breakfast. Had a good time talking to each other. We never brought up what happened with the menu. And one thing that I feel guilty about, even till today, is that with all the education he helped me get, I never once thought to ask him, "Daddy, would you like for me to teach you how to read?" I wonder what he would have said. How could he be gone? How could he be gone? My brother told me that they had not made any arrangements. He wanted me to come home. I said, okay, because I wanted to know what they really had planned. It took me a couple of days. I got there. My brother came and picked me up at the airport. He took me directly to the funeral home. When we got there, some of my other relatives were there. And I looked over and I saw my father in a casket. That surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. And I still didn't believe it. I thought, any moment, he's going to sit up and they're going to holler, "Psych! We psyched you out!" That's what we used to say when we played a trick on somebody. "I psyched you out! I psyched you out!" No, I psyched you out. But he didn't sit up. I thought, okay, I'll do like I've seen some of those preachers do. I'll go over and tap him on his forehead and holler, "Heal!" So I went over, tapped him on his forehead. And he was cold. He was cold as ice. And he was stiff as a brick. did not sit up. I stood there just rubbing on his forehead and his face. This was the first time I had ever touched a body in a casket. But this was my daddy. We had the wake, we had the funeral, and being that he was the first one in our immediate family to pass away, everything went fine. This is a photo of the burial. That's my mother there. That's me with my hand up to my face. I stayed with my mother for about a month after that. Then I went back to San Francisco. But after that, I tried to go home a little bit more often. Fast forward, 2013. I went home to one of our annual family reunions. And while I was there, I decided to go see the barber who had cut my hair when I was in high school. Yes, I had a little bit of hair back then. I hadn't seen him in about 30 years. And barbershops, very important in my life. I remember the first time I went to a barbershop by myself. I was 8 years old. Well, it really wasn't a barbershop. It was a man's house, and he cut hair in his living room. He had a straight back chair, looked like 10,000 people had probably sat in it. He would just throw a sheet around you and cut your hair. This was 1960, and he didn't have electric clippers. He had manual clippers. I could just see him now, clipping up people's head. There were a few couches. I remember a radio. A ball game was on. And where the antenna was supposed to be, there was a coat hanger. The curtains, yes, looked like they'd been up there for a long time. When I first went in, my older brother was sitting in the barber chair. I thought, oh, great, I get to walk home with my big brother. There were a couple of people before me, though. When my brother finished, he paid for his haircut, and he left. He left me there. That made me feel sad. Later on that night, I asked him, why didn't you wait for me? And he said something I have never forgotten. He said, Tommy, time waits for no one. Of course, I didn't know what he meant then, but I know now, and I know how right he was. Actually, I had my first real job in a barbershop. I was 11 years old. This was in a white barbershop. I was a shoe shine boy. A couple of my brothers had the job before me, and as they got older and was able to get better jobs, it was handed down to me. Being a white barbershop, black people couldn't come in unless you worked there like me. There were times some of my friends would see me in there, they would wave, and I'd wave back at them, and they would try to come in, and the owner would say, no, you can't come in here. And that made me feel so horrible. In particular, there was one friend named Bobby. We waved. He tried to come in and was told no. And at that time, I just wanted to sink into the floor out of embarrassment, because by this time we were getting into the civil rights movement, but he couldn't come in because this was the segregated South. There was one barber who I got to know, and he was real friendly. We talked at different times about different things. One day we were talking, and I said something, and he said something. I said something, and he said something. Then out of nowhere he said, "Why, you just a smart little old nigger, ain't you?" And that hurt me to my heart. I wasn't expecting that from him. And it seemed like everybody in the barbershop just stopped and looked at him, and then looked at me. It seemed like it lasted 10 minutes before people started talking again, but it's probably only 5 seconds. I think that I'm still dealing with that trauma. I turned 12 in '64. That was the year that Martin Luther King got his Nobel Peace Prize. Some of those white guys would come in there just bitter. "Well, that Nobel Peace Prize people over in Sweden, they must be scraping the bottom of the barrel to give it to him." That's what they said. But I was glad that he got it. My family was glad that he got it. Everybody that I knew was glad that he got it. But I couldn't say anything. My friend Bobby, about 25 years later, opened a barbershop. And about this time, too, Bobby transitioned into Janine Mancine. I was in college part of the time, and when I got out of college, she knew that I was in psychology, so she would talk to me about what she had to go through for the change or the transition. She had to go through therapy. I think she said she had to go at least for 1 year, maybe more than 1 year. She talked about the hormones. She told me about the operations. She told me everything. And it was so great because she was a wonderful person. Now, Janine was about 6'2", very broad, and she fixed her hair up where it would puff up. They gave her like 3 or 4 more inches. A couple of years ago, I went by her shop and I didn't see her. Then a year or so after that, I went by and the shop was gone. I asked people if they knew what happened to her, and nobody knew. I finally found out that she did pass away. And that made me feel very sad. So, 2013, I go into this barbershop to get my haircut. The first thing that hit me was the smell of the barbershop. The hairspray, the astringent that they used to clean the combs with, the powder on the brushes, the shaving cream. It kind of took me back home and made me think barbershops are where a black man could feel comfortable. We could laugh, we could talk, we could joke, we could sit back, watch the game, have a good time, tell some lies, tell some truths, then tell some more lies, but have a very good time. And when I got there, I was lucky. There was no one sitting in his chair, so I got to sit in his chair. And when we saw each other, it was like we hadn't missed a beat. He told me about people who had passed away, people who had gotten married, told me about some drug issues. He told me about people who had some legal problems. But in general, we were having a very good conversation. I called him up on the things that were happening for me and why I was there. It was a good conversation. About halfway through the conversation, he began to tell me that he was very upset with my father. And I thought to myself, upset with my father? My father had been dead for 25 years. How could he be upset with my father? But I didn't say anything. I didn't want any zigzags going through my head. This barber was a former politician. He was among the first African Americans to be elected to Nashville City Council. He served 3 terms. He told me that during the campaign for one of his elections, my father did something. And until that day, he remembered it. But as he was telling me, I got excited. I didn't know my father had done that. I never thought that he would do that. What he did was fantastic from my point of view. It was revolutionary for him. It seemed like it was a liberation for him. But I didn't say any of that to the barber. I just listened. When I got back to San Francisco, I thought long and hard about what the barber had told me about my father. And I wondered how my father had come to that decision, because what the barber told me was really unlike my father. But in some ways, it was revolutionary for what he said and what he had done. It was almost like a liberation for him. Although the barber didn't like what he did, I felt very, very proud of my father. I thought long and hard. And I kept thinking about it once I got back, and I thought in order to really understand it, I would need to go back into my father's history to see where that came from. That took me back to my great-grandfather in Carthage, Tennessee. He was enslaved. We believe that this is the house where he was enslaved. Now, for some reason, he did not like being enslaved. So, when the Union soldiers came through, he joined the Union soldiers headed toward Georgia. Up in Washington, D.C., there's an organization that pays homage to the African Americans who fought in the Civil War, the African American Civil War Museum. And like lots of museums, they have a very nice monument. And around the monument are a lot of names. About 210,000 black troops who fought in the war. This is what the names look like. Now, there's one name in particular that interests me. That's this one, Willis Simpson. That's my great-grandfather. Nashville, which is the big city close to Carthage, is known for lots of different things. I guess now it's known mostly for country music. But in 1865, there was a bridge built that became part of what a French psychologist called the collective consciousness of what it meant to be black. The Woodland Street Bridge is still there. I've run across it, I've played across it, I've driven across it, I've taken the bus across it many, many times. This is a photo of the first time it was crossed. 1892, in a city called Goodlettsville, which is about 30 miles north of Nashville. There was a woman who was a toll taker. She lived in a hotel-type place with her 2 daughters. Lots of people visited them. One night, 4 black men visited them. They left, then I understand they came back. This was in April. A few days later, it was reported that the daughters had been accosted. So the people in Goodlettsville got all up in arms and wanted to catch the people who did this. They caught one guy. His name was Henry Grizzard. He confessed, and he named another person who was involved. And because he confessed, the people of Goodlettsville took him out and hung him on a tree. The next few days in Nashville, 4 more black men were arrested. 2 were Henry's brothers and 2 other men. They let 3 of them go because of lack of evidence. But they kept a brother named Ephraim Grizzard. He was in the jail. A lot of white men found out that he was there. So they went to the jail to get him, to lynch him. But the sheriff's people at that time, you might say they were good white people. They were not going to turn him over to the mob. So they left. A little bit later on that night, or early the next morning on the 30th, they came again. And this time it was like a mob. But the sheriff's people held their ground. They did not give up Ephraim. The governor got involved. He told the crowd that he wanted it settled legally. So the crowd left again. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there were about 6,000 white men who wanted to get him out of that jail to lynch him. Again, the governor and some of the other leaders did not want to let him go. At one point, they thought they'd take him to another location. But how would they do that? One thought was they might put him in women's clothing to disguise him. Later on in that afternoon, there were about 10,000 people who came to get him out of that jail. They overwhelmed the jailers. They pulled him out of his cell. They marched him towards the Woodland Street Bridge. They were beating him, stabbing at him, calling him names. It was said that he said, "If you stop hitting on me, I won't resist." I also read that there was another black man who worked about 2 blocks away who saw the whole thing. He said that he wished that he could do something, but there was nothing that he could do. He then wished that the bridge would just fall and all of them would drown. They drug him to the bridge, then onto the bridge. They took him to the middle of the bridge. They put a noose around his neck and threw him over. He wanted to live. I read that he was able to grab onto the base of the bridge. Then he started stomping at his fingers. He lost his grip and he fell to his death. But that mob was not satisfied. Every once in a while, one of them would grab the rope and yank on it, and his body would sway in the wind. A lot of the mobsters had guns. They riddled his body with bullets. It was said that he was shot over 200 times, and his body would just sway in the wind. After a while, they had some people pull him up, put him on a car, and wheel him around the neighborhood to sear into that collective consciousness of white supremacy. The message they were trying to give black people: stay in your place. They took his body to Gullisville and showed it to the wife. And remember, the girls did not identify him as the assailant. They burned the body. Then they went home and probably had a good old meal, what they call a social lynching. This is the only photo we have that we believe is of my great-grandfather. That's my great-grandmother with him. We believe that the guy that's up to the right of the wagon is my grandfather. We believe this photo was taken in 1898. That's 2 years after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that legalized separate but equal. My father was born in 1910. This was during the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan, the Night Riders. It was the time of ropes, lynchings, bombings, peonage, burning. Here's a map of the lynchings that took place. You know, I never saw my father look a white man in the eye. In some ways, the terror worked, and that it seared into the collective consciousness of some of my relatives. White supremacy. But my family survived. This photo is of a wedding. That's my grandmother and my grandfather in front. That's my father in the back with the bow tie, kind of snazzy looking. The baby that's fourth from the right is my cousin. Her name is Mary Pearl. She lives in Indianapolis. She is the only person alive now from this photo. But the terror continued. February 28th, 1939, Arlington, Tennessee, outside of Memphis. Jesse Lee Bonds, a young black farmer, 21 years old, goes into the general store to get his provisions to grow his crops. But Jesse, he was a young businessman. One thing he wanted to get was a receipt for the goods that he got. Now, they didn't give receipts, and the owner of the store was not there. His son was there. Jesse talked him into giving him a receipt. The next day when the owner comes in, oh my God, he gets infuriated that his son has given Jesse a receipt. You know, you give that such a receipt, then all of them are going to want receipts. He said, I want you to go out there and get those things and bring them back and bring that receipt back too. You wonder, what's the big deal about a receipt? Well, this was during sharecropper times. People would come in, get things on credit. They wouldn't get a receipt. They'd work, grow their goods during the season, then they'd come back to settle up. And no matter how good of a season they had, they always felt short, according to the store owner. Well, you had a good summer here, but you still turned up a little bit short. Well, I'll tell you what we do. We'll just add that on to what you owed us for last year. But if they had a receipt, they would know exactly what they spent, exactly what they owed, and exactly how much they earned. When Jesse Lee Bond returned to the store, he was immediately shot at. One story I read is that he ran out of the store and that he hid in an outhouse. They came out of the store and riddled the outhouse with bullets. He stumbled out of the outhouse. They caught him. They stripped him. They castrated him. They tied him to a wagon and drug him to the Hatchie River, where they staked him to the bottom of the river so his body wouldn't float away. He was there 4 or 5 days before his body was claimed. A story that I read is that the 2 men who shot him were put on trial, but they were immediately found innocent. This is a copy of his death certificate. It says that he fell and accidentally drowned in the Hatchie River. 1939. There was a bill in Congress that year to outlaw lynchings. It was not passed. In New York, there was a Jewish schoolteacher who wrote a poem, and this poem had to do with what was happening at the time. It was a searing poem. He was involved with the peace and freedom movement. He tried to get some of the major stars to turn the poem into a song, but most refused. He turned it into a song himself and began to sing it. But he still could not get one of the major artists to perform it until one of them heard it. And she liked it. Her management did not want her singing it. The government did not want her singing it. They thought it might rile the black community, but she loved it. I read that when she would sing it sometimes, all the waitering would stop. The lights would go down. There would be a light on her face. She sang it, and then she would walk off stage. That artist was Billie Holiday. The name of that song, Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on their leaves, blood at their roots, black bodies swinging in the summer breeze. Strange fruit swinging from the poplar trees. It was about this time that my father moved from the Carthage area to Nashville, to the big city. He got a job at the Davis Cabinet Company. He worked there for a while. Then he got a better job at the Newhoff Packing Company. The Newhoff Packing Company. That's where he worked as long as I knew he was working. At Newhoff, there was a man that worked with him, and I got to meet this man a couple of years ago. At the time, he was about 94 years old. He told me what it was like working with my father. He was very complimentary of my father. He said my father was a good man, that he was a good worker, and that he was a hard worker. Now, working in a meatpacking plant, you had to work hard to keep up. He also said that working at Newhoff was the best job an uneducated man could get in Nashville. he met my mother. They began to court. It's my understanding that he said, I want to have lots of children. You take care of my children, and I'll take care of you. So they had one child, then another child, then another child. Then the terror struck again. This was in Columbia, Tennessee, about 45 miles or so south of Nashville. February 25th, 26th, 1946. There was an African-American woman. She took her radio into a shop to be repaired. It was a Castronut shop. But for some reason, she couldn't get it back. She would go, it wouldn't be ready. She would go, it wouldn't be ready. She heard that maybe the clerk sold it to somebody else, but she wanted her radio. You have to remember, this was 1946. There were not 200 cable channels. As a matter of fact, a lot of people didn't even have television. So radio was their connection to the world. So she needed her radio. She went back again. She got it, went home, it didn't work. So she came back. And this time, she brought her son with her. Her name was Mrs. Gladys Stevenson. Her son's name was James. She goes in, talks to the clerk, and says, I don't know what she said, but I imagine it went something like that. Hello, sir. I'm sorry, but my radio's still not working. What do you mean it's not working? It was working when you left, wasn't it? Well, it may have been working then, but when I got home and plugged it in, it didn't work. Then what did you do? Well, I didn't do anything. Well, Sadie, you must have done something. Sir, it's just not working. And they got into this back and forth, arguing almost. There was another clerk who saw what was going on. He went up there and stepped in front of that clerk and started talking even rougher to Mrs. Stevenson. And at one point, it looked like he was going to slap her. Now remember, her son James was with her. James was a veteran of World War II. He was in the Navy. He had just gotten back from the Pacific Theater defeating the Japanese. He was not about to let this white man hit his mother. Ooh. Now, the first time I saw a black man slap a white man was at the movies. It was at the Ritz Theater in Nashville. Now, the Ritz Theater was the only black theater in town. That's where we all went. It was about 3 miles from my house, and we went, and when we went, we walked. And we had a good time walking over there because we knew we were going to see something special. That's where I saw Godzilla, that's where I saw King Kong, that's where I saw the newsreels, and that's where the black people gathered for the movies. This movie, In the Heat of the Night, starring Sidney Poitier. Now, in this movie, he's a detective from Philadelphia. He goes down south to take care of some business. At about the same time, a rich white industrialist goes down to build a plant. Something happens, and this rich white industrialist is killed. And it's about the same time that Sidney's character shows up. We see a black man. The white man's been killed. Obviously, the black man did it. So let's bring him in. And when they brought him in, he had a wad of money on him, which made him even more suspicious. Sidney, calm, cool, collective, explained to them who he was. And once they checked him out, they found out he was legitimate. They even solicited his help in solving the murder. He did. And in doing so, he went and talked to a lot of the townspeople. Most of them were white, and they were not used to talking to a black man. They go in to see this one white man. He's working on his flowers. Sidney comes in, is introduced by the sheriff, and begins to ask him questions. This was a rich white man. He was not used to being asked questions by a black man. But the sheriff didn't say anything. The white man is looking at the sheriff. You gonna let this nigga talk to me like, you gonna let him talk to me like that? But he didn't say anything. Sidney keeps asking. Then he asks a very pointed question, and the white man smacks him. And without one beat, Sidney smacks him back, and everybody's like, ah! They gonna kill him! On the other hand, we were like, yay, he smacked him! He didn't kill him. Can you imagine that happening in real life 20 years earlier in a southern town? This second clerk is there. James is in front of him. They get into this argument, and then they get into this knockdown, drag-out fight. And they fight, and they fall through a window. They're fighting outside. The white people see it happening. They come to help the white man, and they start beating on James. James' mother sees this. She goes to help her son. They start beating on her. Afterwards, Mrs. Stevenson and James were arrested. There was a black businessman in town who was well known by everyone. He began to negotiate. He was able to bail them out of jail. But once he bailed them out, James was arrested again because the clerk's father was upset that this black man had beat his son up, so he wanted him charged with attempted murder. Again, the negotiator comes in, bails him out, and he heads all up to Nashville, getting out of town. In the meantime, there's rumbling going on in the white community. We got to do something. We can't let this black man hit this white man. We got to do something. So they begin to gather and talk. The subject of lynching came up. And it was not unusual that whites would go into the black section of town, hunt for someone, bring them back, and lynch them. And that's what they had planned to do. But the black people, the black men at this time said, no, there would not be a social lynching in this city today. Remember, World War II had ended not too long ago, and a number of them were veterans also, and they had their guns. So they started patrolling the entrance to the bottom, that's what they called it, their side of town. The whites began to drive around, and they would shoot into that section. As tensions grew, the black man and some of the white leaders tried to negotiate to ease the tension. As it got closer to dark, the crowds got larger on the white side. And then on the black side, they were patrolling their territory. They were not going to let anything bad happen to them. When it got dark, the blacks were able to turn off some of the street lights. And then they were able to shoot out some of the others. So you couldn't see in there. It's not quite clear why, but some white deputies, we believe, approached the black section of town. The blacks didn't know what they were doing, so they started shooting. They shot 4 of them. Fortunately, they didn't kill them, but that upped the ante for the whites. That also started the shooting. The blacks held them off. Then they called in the guards. They were still able to hold them off. Then they called in the troopers. And when the troopers came in, the blacks were overrun. They couldn't hold them off. So the whites were able to do exactly what the blacks did not want them to do. To come into their neighborhood, burning their businesses, destroying their businesses, pillaging their businesses and their homes. This went on for almost all of the next day. In some ways, it was kind of like a mini Tulsa. They arrested more than 100 men, more than the jail could hold. They wound up letting all but 25 of them go. Now, Why have a trial? 25 black men accused of attempted murder of white men in the South. You know what's going to happen. They're going to be found guilty. They're going to prison, or worse, they may be executed. But something magical happened. There was this young black attorney in Nashville who was irate at what happened. He came on to defend them. The NAACP got involved. They sent an up-and-coming lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, to work for the defense also. There was this white civil rights lawyer from Chattanooga who came. He joined. And there was another lawyer who joined. The prosecution presented their case. The defense presented its case. This made national news. This was the first race riot after the war. When the judge got the verdict from the jury, I read somewhere that it looked like he was puzzled, that he read it 2 or 3 times before he announced it. And when he announced it, 23 of the men were found innocent. Some people say that was God talking. 2 were found guilty. There was a second trial. And these trials were moved from Columbia to Lawrenceburg. In the second trial, Thurgood Marshall came back. And the whites were gunning for Thurgood Marshall. And it was one of those tricky things where they were looking for him, they were waiting for him, and if he had gone one way, he would have gone to the mob. If he had gone in one direction, he would have gone into the mob. If he'd gone the other direction, it was towards freedom. Fortunately, he went toward freedom. At the time, he was leaving Columbia. At the time, he was leaving Lawrenceburg every day to drive back up to Nashville. After that, he started staying there until the trial was over. The second trial, one was found innocent and one was found guilty. And some people say he was found guilty because he was a little bit uppity when he was on the witness stand. But he was convicted of a lesser crime. This made national news. It was one of the first times after the wars that black people fought back, which in some ways helped predict what was coming later. My mother and my father had another child, and another child, and another child. About 15 years ago, we found this photo. When we first saw it, we were embarrassed. We didn't want anybody to see that photo. What good could come from a group of kids that looked like that? I was talking to you about the barber. Now, the barber was born in 1933 in Mississippi from a large family. He too had to go out and work the fields, pick cottons as a kid. He too had difficulty getting an education. He had to walk 3 miles to high school. While in high school, he decided to drop out so he could join the army and fight in the Korean War. So he signed up. He went to basic training, and as it turns out, the war ended 2 weeks before his basic training ended. So he didn't get to go to Korea. But he was in service for his country. About 1954, as he's getting out, he finds out that he's the father of a young girl. This young girl spent time in Mississippi with the grandmother. The mother went up to Philadelphia, spent time there. Sometimes she spent time with him. After a series of different events, by the time she got 14, she lived with her father. And that was probably the best thing that could happen to her. Yes, she turned out to be very, very successful. 1955, August, Emmett Till was killed. December 55, the Rosa Parks incident happened. During the late 50s, early 60s and on, Nashville was very much involved with the civil rights movement, with the boycotts, the sit-ins. In 1960, it was in April, you remember Z. Alexander Luby? He was a lawyer in Nashville, and he worked really hard with the civil rights workers and leaders, bailing them out, raising money, going to court with them. His house was bombed. Fortunately, he was not harmed. The people who bombed it thought that that would scare people away. And it was scary. I remember it was a scary time. 3,000 people came together for a silent march. One of the big things that was happening at that time was they wanted to be able to go in the restaurants and eat. A few weeks after that, that happened. It was a victory. One thing that my mother always wanted, she wanted her kids to be educated. In 1960, my sister Etta graduated from high school. My mother told her, if you go to college, I'll pay for everything. Just go to school. She wanted her to be an example for the rest of us to get educated. Both she and my father's mantra became, get your education and nobody can take it away from you. My sister, she was accepted into Tennessee State A&I, which is now Tennessee State University. In order for her to go to school, my mother had to go work for the rich white folks in Bellmead section of town, where she had to go in the back door because blacks were not allowed to go in the front door at the time. That humiliation. She had to cook, iron, wash, take care of the kids, and a myriad of other things. And she was only paid a few dollars a day. But she wanted to do it to make this example. And all was going well. Everybody was happy. Until one day, my sister was headed to school. She took the Jefferson Street bus, headed to Tennessee State. She got off at 33rd and Jefferson, headed to her class. And as she got off, there was a young man there, about her age. His name was Leo Lillard. He was passing out flyers. He was passing out flyers about upcoming boycotts, sit-ins. He invited my sister to come to some of the nonviolent training meetings. Without my mother knowing, she started going. She joined the Nonviolent Student Coordinating Committee. And this was an organization that was bent on getting civil rights for all Americans, especially African Americans. Here's a photo of her at one of the boycotts. You'll see next to her is Mr. Lewis. It was in May 4th, that a number of students, young people, took off from Washington, D.C. on two buses headed to New Orleans. They were hoping to get to New Orleans by the 17th. Everything went fine. They were testing the civil rights of black people in particular. Specifically, they were testing two rulings by the Supreme Court that said interstate buses could not be segregated, but down south they were. They were named the Freedom Riders. They wanted to have the freedom to sit where they wanted to. The bus got to Atlanta. Things went relatively well. Leaving Atlanta, the two buses split up. One went a northerly route headed towards Anniston. The other one took a little southerly route. Both were headed toward Birmingham. The bus that went through Anniston was bombed. The bus headed to Birmingham, got to Birmingham, and everything was really quiet. They didn't see anybody. They were like, wow, this is going to be okay. But by the time they parked and started getting off the bus, white men surrounded the bus. They came at them with clubs and chains and knives, and they beat them, some of them very badly. And believe it or not, some of the whites were hurt worse than the blacks, because the whites considered them traitors to the race. It was at this time that a lot of people thought, okay, we need to stop this bus ride. We don't want anybody to get killed. But then there was a group of people in Nashville who said, no, we cannot stop the buses. We cannot stop the freedom rides. Because if we do that, the racists will know that if they cause a little violence, we would stop. And they didn't want that to be the case. So there was a gathering in Nashville. They said yes, they would take up the rides. Students from Tennessee State, Fisk, there was a seminary, and some other colleges. And on one of those buses was my sister, Etta. Now, my parents did not want her to get involved. Partly for fear of her life, but partly if where my father worked found out that his daughter was participating, he could have been fired. And then how was he going to feed all of his children? So it caused quite a bit of trauma in my family. They get to Birmingham. There's a lot of ruckus. But the main thing is they couldn't get a bus driver to take them to the next stop, which was going to be Montgomery. Here's a photo of my sister with two other freedom riders in the terminal. They had to stay there all night. President Kennedy got involved. His brother got involved. There were some negotiations involved. They finally got a bus driver who would take them, but they were escorted by troopers, helicopters to Montgomery. When my sister got to Montgomery, she got word that the regents of Tennessee was going to expel the students who participated if they did not come back to Nashville and take their test. Leo Lillard borrowed a station wagon, came down to Montgomery, got them, took them back to Nashville. They took their test. Right after my sister finished her tests, her exams, she got on another bus, headed back down, scaring my parents almost to death. This time, they went from Nashville to Memphis to Jackson. And when they got to Jackson, they were immediately arrested. This is a photo of her arrest. Now, some of the things that happened to her She doesn't remember. Kind of like me. If it wasn't for the photos, she may not know. Me, being a smart aleck, a number of years ago, said, if you don't remember, having gone to school for psychology, I said, why don't you get hypnotized? And then you can remember all of that. And then we thought, well, if she doesn't remember the arrest, all of the arrest, where she was taken, how long she was in jail, maybe there's a good reason that she doesn't remember it. And it's not like she forgot yesterday. She hasn't been able to remember almost practically since she got back. Here's a photo of her. This is a photo that was in Life magazine. We believe it's the church where Rab Abernathy was the minister. John Lewis is in this photo also. She remembers being at a house during this period once she got out. She doesn't remember whose house it was, but Dr. King was there. Ralph Abernathy was there. And some of the other leaders of the civil rights movement was there. Seared in my head is my sister and my mother crying in our living room. A few years ago, I mentioned this to my sister and asked her if she remembered what it might be about. She told me that when she got back from the march, my mother brought her a letter saying that she had been expelled from Tennessee State for participating in the riots. And that just crushed my mother. Back to the barber. It's 1962. He's trying to figure out what he can do in his life to make his life better for he and his family. I'm assuming he's tired of working as a janitor and a dishwasher. He decides what he wants to do is become a barber. So he goes to barber college. He graduates. He interns. Then he buys his own barbershop. This was around 1965. That's the barbershop I went into in 2013. As a barber, he felt like he could be closer to the people. He felt like he could be more helpful in the community. He felt like he could become more of a participant. He felt like he could become more of a participant in the community because he wanted to do some good things. I have another sister who was involved in the movement. Her name was Kathleen. She went on a number of the protests, the boycotts, the sit-ins. I spoke with her about this a number of years ago, and she told me that she remembered at one of the protests seeing two policemen beating a black kid on the sidewalk. Okay, I thought she's been a little bit hysterical. A number of years ago, we found the photo. This is that photo. She also told me that at another protest, that she was beaten very badly. Beaten so bad that she was knocked out, that she had to go to the hospital, that she was beaten all over her body. She told me that the doctors told her that she probably wouldn't be able to have any kids. She has had a number of physical issues during her life. But again, I'm thinking, okay, but maybe a little bit hysterical. Last year, my sister Ada was at an event. A guy calls her over and asks who she is. They went to school together. He told her that he had a photo of Kathleen. The photo that he had was of Kathleen being put on a gurney after being beaten by the police. Here is that photo. Now, the crazy thing and the infuriating thing about this photo is the caption. It mentions her name, it mentions when, mentions where, but it says that she fainted because she had heart problems. Unfortunately, I don't think that's so unusual. The Civil Rights Movement is moving on. The Civil Rights Act passes. The Voting Rights Act passes. I have another sister. Her name is Linda. Linda became one of the first African Americans to be the president of the Nashville Metropolitan Teachers Association. One year, they decided to have a big program to honor people who had been in the school system for a certain period of time. There was also a banquet toward the end of the year. There became a little controversy as to who was going to make the keynote speech at this event. As it turns out, my sister Linda made the keynote speech. This is a photo of her making that speech. Now, look at that picture and look at the people in the background. Do they look happy? I wonder why. Usually, they would be making the speech. Again, looking at this picture, it reminds me of another recent picture. This one. That's President Obama speaking to Congress. And look at the man behind him. Look like he's having a good time? Or do you think he thinks he's supposed to be up there? Time keeps moving on. I have another brother, Ernest. Ernest went to West Point. He didn't graduate from West Point, he graduated from Rutgers, but he was there. That's his photo. What good could come from a family of kids that look like that family of kids? Now, this is a photo of me. It's when I was in college at David Lipscomb. I was in a talent show. I didn't win the show. I came in third place, but I got the largest spread in the yearbook. This is me at my graduation, and that's my younger sister, Sheila. This is a photo 17 years later of my younger sister graduating, and I'm at her graduation at Tennessee State. Get your education, and nobody can take it away from you. This is a photo of my little brother, the one I gave the dime to, Nathan. He played football for the Green Bay Packers. This is his photo. Now, when I look at this photo, he's the running back, and I see him running, but I see this big giant guy running after him, and I wonder, ooh, what happened? But get your education, and nobody can take it away from you. When programs like Roots came on TV, my father would not watch them. We would try to get him to watch them. Daddy, this is very good. This is history. I mean, we've got some good actors. There are black people. Come on and watch this. And he would say, why has I got to watch it when I's done lived it? I often wish I had asked him what he meant by that. My assumption is the trauma that he experienced growing up in the South as a black man, never being able to look a white person in the eye. Why would he want to be reminded of that? Now I see, but I still wish I'd gotten it from his voice. Now, James Brown has this song, "This is a Man's World." You can believe that or not. But the second part of that song is, "It wouldn't be nothing without a woman or girl." This is the photo of my father and my mother. And without her, he wouldn't be as half the person he is. Now, I told you a number of things as we've spent this time together. I told you about my great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War and the African American Civil War Museum. After the war ended, the black soldiers, the black troops could not march in the Grand Parade. There was another parade 50 years later. They could not march in that parade either. Fast forward 150 years, 2015. The museum organization organized a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue to honor the black soldiers and the black troops who fought in the Civil War. There are about 210,000 of them. Fortunately, I was able to go with some of my other family members. My niece went. She participated in the march. She dressed up in period attire. This is a video of her.
Who are you?
I am Willissa Rowland. I'm marching in the Civil War Red Review Parade because my great-grandfather, Willis Simpson, was not allowed to march before the president, along with all the other African Americans who fought in the Civil War. So today we are recreating that event in order to pay honor to those men, and I will be representing him as a soldier in the parade.
What was his name?
Willis Simpson.
Thank you.
Here's another video of a part of the parade to give you a sense of what happened.
The 28th, the 37th, and the 38th. It's okay.
I also shared with you the story of Ephraim. 125 years later, a number of universities and churches came together to honor him, his memory, his brother, and 2 other African Americans who had been hung, as a way of paying homage to all the close to 4,000 who were hung. There's a plaque outside the church in their honor. I also told you that my sister, Etta, was expelled from school. In 2008, Tennessee State brought those students back to campus for a week-long celebration of what they did as freedom riders and their work in the civil rights movement. There were seminars, there were classes, there were dinners, there was a graduation. There were 14 of them. A couple had passed, so family members represented them. And at this graduation, each one of them were presented an honorary doctor's degree. That's my sister, Ada, holding her degree. She's crying. That's the photo that was in the newspaper. Another photo. This is a photo of my family now. It was taken a number of years ago. All of us are there except one. Maybe something did come out of that family from that photo that we found so many years ago. I guess you want to know what my father did. Well, as I mentioned, we lived not very far from where the barber lived, probably about 2.5 blocks. And as I mentioned earlier, he was a politician. And during one of his elections, my father did something that disturbed him. I imagine during the election, he was driving around. He came to my parents' house and he saw something. And what he saw was a sign in my parents' yard that was for his opponent. Now, it was very unusual for my father to put anything in the yard. He did not want to stand out. He did not want decals put on the car. He didn't want Christmas decoration on the porch. He didn't want Christmas decoration. Eventually, we were able to put up Christmas decorations, but it was generally on Christmas Eve, and we took it down pretty soon after that. He didn't want to stand out in any way, form, or fashion, so for him to have that sign was very special. But for the barber, I'm assuming he felt it was an insult. I imagine that my father was sitting on the porch, and the person who was running against him saw him on the porch, knew us, knew where we lived, said, "Mr. Simpson, can I put a sign in your yard?" And I can imagine that his life flashed before him, yes or no. And then I can see flashing before him the music of the civil rights movement. I can see him seeing Dr. King. I can see him flashing with Malcolm X. I'm sure he heard about the Black Panther stores. He knew about James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm black and I'm proud. He heard Aretha Franklin because we played it. I can imagine he heard Jesse Jackson speaking, I am somebody. And I can imagine at that moment, he stood up and said, "Yes, child, go ahead and put that sign there." I can imagine him saying, "I done raised my kids. I done got them their education. I own my house. I pay my taxes. I am somebody. I'm free. I can have this sign here. Yeah, just put it there. Put it there. Because I'm a man. I'm a man. I'm a man. And I am free. I am free. I am free. And that, my friends, is the story of courage under fire, the liberation